So I've been trying to talk to y'all about prophecy. And so a lot of people believe that Mark couldn't have been written anytime before 70 AD because he's clearly talking about let the reader understand, all those things. We talk about, I think, Mark 13 and things like that. And so with Jesus did prophesy the end of the temple. You can talk about John 2, but also I think it was Matthew 26 when he's in front of the high priest, and they were trying to find some erroneous charges against him and couldn't find any, so they resigned to talking about what somebody witness heard. What some witness had heard that he had talked about the temple being destroyed. And I know you say he was talking about his own body. This is fine. I mean, so maybe he didn't technically prophesy it, but for all intents and purposes, that's what they understood it to be. And I've done videos about how judgment starts with his own house, but I be hearing people go on. I mean, shout out to Jim Wagner, Minivan Traveler, but this dude was saying, the Matthew 24 is talking about the structures in your mind, and you ain't going to have some real thing unless you shout out to Dispensational Tim, talk about rebuilding the whole city. And so they got this whole pre-trib premillennial futurism that it's problematic for a variety of reasons, but this has to do with the first resurrection. And the first resurrection, I'm going to talk crazy. I'm going to mess around and say that already happened. Legit. And it's going to be hard to understand because you got to understand that Matthew was written after Paul. Matthew's written after Paul. And Luke or Matthew, which one of them was written first, you have to say they were written independently of one another because they don't always jive and meld with one another. That one couldn't be looking at, because if they're both true, then, and I'm not saying that they're not true together. Like, I mean, when they were when they got to the point of the Council of Nicaea, they already fixed them up real good. But so I'm not going to say there's some blatant contradiction or something. But I mean, they aren't the same book. I mean, you do run into problems, and so you got to say that they were written independently of one another. Otherwise, one has to believe the other one isn't scripture, and if one doesn't believe the other one is scripture, then you can't have what we have today, where people be gung-ho about the Bible because they just don't understand writing back then. Like, it was written as an oracle for a specific purpose. And these highfalutin people, with their robes and everything, in the high court and in this they had it good. I mean, they were getting the best parts and everything, and they were educated and everything, and people would have to bring it in to the central location. But you gotta understand, back then you didn't have easy peasy systems like you have in Disney's Robin Hood with the Sheriff Nottingham or Matthias Levi, where they just gonna go house to house like the Romans set up, to collecting the tax. They would have people bring it in to them. So you gotta have a whole reason behind it and justification. So people ended up becoming justified by the justification. They had to bring their sacrifice to these guys, and that was, people's access to God, straight up. And that's clear. I mean, you see Eli sitting there, and Hannah brings the sacrifice and the baby and all that. And so these priests were not redeemed. You talk about the sons of Aaron and the sons of Abraham and all these different people. You only have but the sons of Adam and all of them. You only have but one that gets held in a high status, but the rest, you know, they get excommunicated or buried in Sheol. And excommunicated back then was the same thing in a lot of ways, because we are all like sheep gone astray. And so the city is where you have the walled in location, but you can only have so much farmland in that walled in location. So in good times you might be down on the hills outside of the walls, and that's where the peasants and farmers and all of them live. But you have the whole location of Jerusalem didn't even make sense uh until after the invasion of the Sea People, because it's, I mean, even as it's a anachronistically about Moses, he couldn't even go the route of the Philistines. So if the settled Canaanites did have farmland, um, back down in the Levant, it wasn't until after the invasion of Sea Peoples that you have these walled up cities in Jerusalem and Jericho on the other side of the mountain, where you don't see them until you cross over. And they hidden down by the valley down there. And so when you have this situation, that this is how you get into Jerusalem, but that they had security on their borders. They had the city wall, and they had dipped down into the pool of Siloam with the Hezekiah's tunnel and everything. But so this is where you get stories like Judith and was it Isaiah 37 and Second Kings. I don't even know what, like around 18 or 19, but like you have this situation. I think it's Second Kings 20, but you have this situation where they're protected within the walls, and that the walls provide certain security. But then after this, you have the Judaic sources coming in talking about, even if you didn't have the walls, even if you were crying at the river, you're still blessed going in, coming out, everything. And but that's just who you are. But you also have been excommunicated on purpose, because the bad things happen by the same power as the good things. And I think it's 2 Kings 19. I'm not going to find it exactly, but somewhere around there. But you have this this death of Ezekiel 36. Under the prophecy of Ezekiel 34, the judgment of the goats and the sheep. Then you got 37, the resurrection. And the resurrection is actually the end of captivity, because as Jeremiah said, he's going to make an end out of all nations, but to them, their end is just going to be the excommunication. And so that way you have the regathering, and clearly both houses, right? It's in 37 there. You have the resurrection. Excuse me. and so that resurrection then, as we get into Matthew, he talk about it. He talk about it, but it's kind of hard to understand. So that's what I'm trying to explain to you. And so he talk about in chapter 13, the wheat and tares growing together. Someone run in, the devil run in and planted tares amongst the wheat. And so the gardeners say, let them grow together, and then we'll chop it down in the last day. And Jesus been steady talking through Matthew about that last day, like, real soon you're gonna see the Son of Man sitting exactly where Saint Stephen seen him. Saint Stephen look up and hear Jesus, right at the right hand of Almighty God, just as it says in Daniel 7:13, and Revelation 1:17, and a bunch of other places. They play into this idea of Daniel 7:13, the one that looks like a son of man, and they've been looking like the Son of Man. Entertain angels unaware, as they say in Hebrews, was actually from what, Genesis? I don't even know, 15 or something. Whatever, Genesis with Sodom and Gomorrah. You have the three angels that come down, and he's entertaining angels unaware. Abraham. And so when Jacob prevailed against the angel, he got the angel to submit. So the angel that he got to submit was Esau, because Esau, it was basically Samael. It was the god Azazel, the one that was going to curse him ends up blessing him. And this is like Balaam. Balaam was supposed to curse him, end up blessing him. And so this is actually the end of the Midiani people and the Moabites and all them. So then we get into the stories of Ruth and all that, and then you go into the Bible, and around First Kings 10, you have Ammon and all them. But yeah, this is in Gilead and all that, and but that's actually where they came out of, because like I said, the sea people were in there, and the sea people made it so everything that they wanted they took. So people had to live, really pastorally, you know what I mean? And it was actually these Cretans, proto Philistines, like in the earlier days, that probably were where the Shasta people came from the jump. Like, why are people living way out in these Bedouin communities? It's because the good areas was taken up and they were kind of marginalized. But these Philistines were Greeks, even though they spoke Hamitic. That's because language came out of Egypt and all that. How they got it, of course, have a cuneiform, but that wasn't necessarily how they received it. And maybe they did. Maybe they came with cuneiform, migrated all the way over there, but they probably came before then. But let's say they migrated all over there with cuneiform. They might have lost a lot of that, and then or melded it into what they know about Egypt, and the rest is history. But so you get the situation where they're in east of the Jordan, and that's how they get in. I guess Joshua had got the river to stop, and they walked right across. Some went still and everything, but this is where you start getting into. Joshua's a little more Israelitish, but you get into these Jedi sources a little later, where all of a sudden these Canaanites and all of them aren't the biggest problem. It's it's the ones closely related. It's like the Idumeans and kind of these other Hebrew groups that, Ishmael is really disregarded, and but you have this problem where when you try to make these these other sons of Abraham Gentiles, that a lot of other things don't make sense, and even if they do make sense, you still run into the problem that Paul puts you in, is that if Jacob is wrestled with um, Esau, or struggling with his God, then you have this problem where it's because Esau be the firstborn and had the birthright originally. And this is a recurring motif. I mean, Cain, uh, Ishmael, all of them were firstborns of sorts. And then but then you have like Ezra wanting to just kick people out like Abraham did, Ishmael and all that. And so you have this belief that it doesn't even matter what's right. It doesn't even matter if this person overlaid her baby and she gets the other person's baby, or they decided to cook this baby and the other person took the baby. It doesn't even matter, because you gotta do what's good for you, And so this is where a lot of like Moses Mendelssohn and all of them, they kind of believe in this cultural religion where they can use parts of it and not use other parts of it, and update it however they see fit. So maybe Moses Mendelssohn created reformism, but you end up having this problem that Paul pointed out. And Paul pointed out how when you have the firstborn disinherited, like the sons of Aaron that went underground, like when even Aaron himself, where he was supposed to talk and hear Moses talking, here it's like the priests were meant to be replaced, by the Melchizedek, and just as David replaced Saul, you have just as the Samaritans replaced the Israelites, you have this replacement theology built in. And but things was not looking good, for a while, because after the Seleucids and all them, then came the Romans, and it was just it was bad. So they had a lot of identity with crying, like in Psalm 137, crying at the rivers of Babylon, and then all the anger associated with it. We're gonna dash their babies, just really kind of angry, violent kind of stuff. And like just like in the Kittos War, just the fervor, the zealous fervor. I mean, the zealotry is what caused all the problems, even when the first temple was destroyed. And because you can't really stop progress, and you might think your language is better and your religious structure is better. That's fine, because that's how Christianity ended up becoming such a decisive win that it's become popular to this day. That it's Steelman, the argument that it was a Steelman argument to go to all the messianism, and because that was the ultimate goal. And but the big difference is Christianity is pre-messianism, but Jedi's is Jedi's is premillennialism, messianism, and the millennia is basically the messianic era, right? Because after that, I mean, it's all over. And but what does all over mean? I don't think at all that the Christians had any idea how popular this would be. So the fact that it carries on to this day, it was beyond them. So when they were talking about the time of the Gentiles, I'm guessing they weren't talking about. I think that the time of the Gentiles is the millennium. And this has to do with Romans 11, how they're going to stay blind until this time is over. So I think the time of the Gentiles is namely when the legion was posted up as military occupation in Jerusalem. And this happened during the Kittos War. And we don't really have that much Bible from before this time as a compiled important book. The councils and all of them came after this fact. So in the second century, you have, Bar Kokhba and Kittos, you have people rising up. And this is when they was really focusing on the Parthian Empire, the Romans were. And so they were all ganging up, the Parthians and what do you call them? They called them, you go to Wikipedia right now, they'll call them Jedis, straight up. So how them Jedis, even when the temple was up there, mostly in Egypt, how is Mordecai over there when Ezra right here? You know what I mean? Like, it makes no sense. Especially when you got this ultra Zera seed doctrine where it has to be a physical descendant when they didn't know who was who. I mean, really? So what it all boils down to is that Paul used that favorite second born against them. He was basically saying, well, the Gentiles be the second born because it goes to the Jedis first, then to them. And so this time the Gentiles was the occupation when the legions were in there, and as long as 600 years until Umar liberated Jerusalem. This because the Gentiles is Romans. So because they controlled the world, that they were the nations, they were worldwide, they were the empire, they were Palpatine and Darth Sidious, and so you have situations rising up like with the Maccabees even long before them. This is how they got such notoriety, and everybody wanted to be one of them, just like it says in Esther. You know what I mean? Because they was putting it down, especially Judas Maccabeus, the hammer. Woo-wee. I mean, they say like he jumped on an elephant and brought that elephant down. But so when you have that problem where if you say that you can get rid of the first, like the Samaritans, and then take their identity, then how come you can't do that again? If you're justifying it, and so this messianism is kind of confusing to a lot of people because a lot of people don't see when the sun come out that it turned red, the sky, that's not as typical as when the sun sets and it turns red. So they're going to say it's bad weather, but they had got the day and the night confused because they wanted day first, but in Hebrew, it comes night first. So we get into Joel where it's first laying down that there's going to be the smackdown, and then you have fates reverse. So the smackdown actually come in the day of the Lord, and the day of the Lord was 70 AD, but biblically it wasn't. Biblically, it comes in the form of Jesus, and Jesus was Israel. Jesus was the temple. Jesus was the everything. And so this is a substitute mentally. You have to think of this as a mental substitute. And so the resurrection of Matthew 27, like you go to Matthew 27 at the end there, verses 52, 53. I mean, this isn't corroborated by any of the other accounts that you have this first resurrection. So how could you be getting into Revelation talking about the first resurrection when that already happened? How did everybody miss the first resurrection? I'll tell you why. Because you're thinking about it literally, in temporally, when it's really in your mind's eye, and you have to induce it. When you keep deducing, and I'm a big fan of deducing. I don't like induction. I don't like intuition. I like math. But you just keep inducing, and you get to the right conclusion because you can't deduce this, because it's not based on fact. It's based on faith. And so we have faith that this was what was prophesied. So that, because it's prophesied, it was God's divine will. And if God's divine will was to set it up, then how can man thwart that anyway? So if it's metaphysically existing, then how can it just be physically destroyed without entering into the divine and changing that, or else the divine's will be done on earth? Either way. And so this first resurrection brings us into the millennium, because this is when death was defeated. Death was defeated or thrown underground, where all the people that didn't take place in the first resurrection. Because Jesus went down to Hades and preached to David, preached to Moses and all them, and saved them. And so they, through faith, resurrected. This was the first resurrection. And they reign on earth in just me talking about it. Romans 16, where Paul talks about Isaiah and all them, how they were prophesied that they would inherit the nations. That's how they inherited the nations. Because all these nations, like me, I'm not all the nations, but I'm a member of a nation. I'm reading it today. But they had no idea it would last this long. They thought the time of the Gentiles might be 1,000 years. It might only be a few years, but don't wait for it to end, you know. They're going to continue to disbelieve. We're going to have to continue to occupying until they don't care anymore. That was when the time of the Gentiles ended, when nobody cared anymore. And that never happened, because Christianity, which its whole purpose was to take a book of Hebrewism and say that it has been fulfilled, when it was all prophecy of what was going to happen. But that prophecy of what was going to happen was coming from crying. It was coming from not being able to self-actualize. So that is a problem. I want every nation to be able to self-actualize. But it doesn't mean 2,000 years later recreate that, because that was not the point ever. That had nothing to do with Matthew 24. Matthew 24 is saying the same thing that Paul and all of them is saying. The first resurrection is hard to understand because Matthew does come after Paul, so how could he talk about it already happened when Paul was saying it was going to happen? Well, that's because you got to understand that none of this is about history. None of this is about history.